What happened to the land of Israel following the Assyrian conquest? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 2 Kings on walking through the Bible.
The glory of his cross.
Today we're going to be discussing 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 24 to 41. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 24. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 2 Kings chapter 17, beginning at verse 24. Then the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. And they took possession of Samaria and dwelt in its cities. And it was so at the beginning of their dwelling there, that they did not fear the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So they spoke to the king of Assyria, saying, The nations whom you have removed and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the rituals of the God of the land. Therefore he has sent lions among them, and indeed they are killing them, because they do not know the rituals of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria commanded, saying, Send them one of the priests whom you brought from there. Let him go and dwell there, and let him teach them the rituals of the God of the land. Then one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and dwelt in Bethel, and taught them how they should fear the Lord. However, every nation continued to make gods of its own, and put them in the shrines and the high places which the Samaritans had made, every nation in the cities where they dwelt. The men of Babylon made Succoth-Benoth, the men of Cuth had made Nergal, the men of Hamath made Ashima, and the Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak, and the Sepharites burned their children in the fire of Adrolamech and Anamelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. So they feared the Lord. From every class they appointed for themselves priests of the high places, who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high places. They feared the Lord, yet served their own gods, according to the rituals of the nations from among whom they were carried away. To this day they continue practicing the former rituals. They do not fear the Lord, nor do they follow their statutes or ordinances, or the law and commandment which the Lord had commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel, with whom the Lord had made a covenant, and charged them, saying, You shall not fear other gods, nor bow down to them, nor serve them, nor sacrifice to them. But the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt with great power and an outstretched arm, him you shall fear, him you shall worship, and to him you shall offer sacrifice. And the statutes, the ordinances, the law, and the commandment which he wrote to you, you shall be careful to observe forever. You shall not fear other gods. And the covenant that I have made with you, you shall not forget, nor shall you fear other gods. But the Lord your God you shall fear, and he will deliver you from the hand of all your enemies. However, they did not obey, but they followed their former rituals. So these nations feared the Lord, yet served their carved images. Also their children and their children's children have continued doing as their fathers did, even to this day. In the last two lessons, we have been looking at the Assyrian conquest of Israel in about 722 BC. This occurred during the reign of Hoshea, the final king of Israel, and was caused by Israel's continued idolatry, which was contrary to the commands of God given through Moses. God had sent Israel numerous prophets, including Elijah, Elisha, Amos, and Hosea, to warn Israel to repent or God would judge them. But alas, they didn't listen, and so God sent the Assyrians under Shalmaneser V to conquer Israel and carry it off into captivity. Now, when we read of this captivity, we do not understand something that will be important for understanding the situation in the region during the time of Jesus. Not every Israelite was taken to captivity. The overwhelming majority were, but not every last one. 2 Chronicles 34 verse 9 will make that clear. Why is this important? Because following the conquest, Assyria brought in peoples to repopulate the lands from all across their empire, especially around Babylon. These foreigners would then intermarry with some of the small number from Israel who remained, giving us the Samaritans of Jesus' day. That is why the Jews of Jesus' day often refer to the Samaritans as half-breeds, because they do have some Israelite heritage, but that was mixed with the peoples brought in by the Assyrians to repopulate the land. And just where did the Assyrians place these new peoples? Well, among other places, in the cities of Samaria, which had been Israel up until the conquest. If you notice the borders of Israel during the days of Hosea, it closely mirrors the borders of Samaria during the days of Jesus. That is no coincidence, and their very existence goes all the way back to the captivity here in 2 Kings 17 and the resettlement plan initiated by the Assyrians under Sargon II. Now later, when we get to our study of Ezra, we'll find another influx of people came into the region as well during the days of Esarhaddon, grandson of Sargon. But what we need to realize here is that the beginning of the Samaritans of Jesus' day began right here in 2 Kings 17. Now, of course, when these new peoples settled in what had been Israel, they brought their religion with them, religion that was contrary to the worship of Jehovah. And because of this, God sent lions among them and killed some of them. Now you might ask, how is this fair? For the people of the land didn't know of Jehovah. And while that might be true, ignorance of what we should know, the existence of the true God of heaven, isn't an excuse or a way to escape punishment for our sins. God has given us all the evidence we need to enable us to worship Him and Him alone, and yet we worship gods of our own creation. These people knew that Israel had been taken captive by Assyria, and knowing the superstitious behavior of the people of that time, would have likely thought it was because the God of the land was angry at Israel. And yet, they made no effort to learn about Him. Judah to the south had a righteous king in Hezekiah, and yet they didn't travel to him. Instead, they worshipped idols that they had brought. Recognizing that they were being punished, they asked the king of Assyria, Sargon, to send back a priest from among the Israelites so that they could learn about the ways of the God of the land and avoid the punishment that they were receiving, something that Sargon permitted. Now, yes, the priest that was sent back wasn't a Levite, and yes, he was an idolater, but the God that he worshipped was supposed to be Jehovah, even though Israel had been improperly worshiping Jehovah with the golden calves at Dan and Bethel, contrary to the law. Thus, when the priest taught them how they should fear the Lord, the newcomers to the land were closer to knowing about Jehovah than they had ever been, even if they still weren't worshiping Him properly. But even with this teaching, the people didn't completely abandon their idols, but simply added Jehovah to their pantheon of gods. That is why the writer of 2 Kings makes the peculiar statement that they feared the Lord, yet served their own gods. What that means is that they served Jehovah in addition to their own gods. And of course, the writer of 2 Kings makes clear in verse 34 that no matter what man may think, we're not really fearing the Lord if we do not do the things which He said. In the law of Moses, God had commanded Israel that they weren't to worship other gods. This priest of Israel would have had knowledge of this instruction of Moses, and yet he didn't even follow it himself. So how could it be expected that these newcomers would do even that which this priest of Israel didn't follow? And yet even this wouldn't be an excuse for these people, for they had the ability to know if they truly wanted to, because Judah sat right next to them, and a righteous king was there of whom they could have inquired. But they didn't. And so the writer of 2 Kings tells us that the people continued in these false rituals right up to the day that 2 Kings was written. Later in their history, they would shed their idolatry, something that King Josiah of Judah would have a hand in starting, and over time would morph into the people of Jesus' day. But during the life of the writer of 2 Kings, this is what the people who inhabited Israel did. And so, with this, we come to the end of the history of the northern nation of Israel. On the screen now is a condensed timeline of the 208-year history of that nation that began with Jeroboam in about 930 BC and ended with Hoshea in 722 BC. Over that period, Israel had four main dynasties: the house of Jeroboam, the house of Baasha, the house of Omri, and the house of Jehu. All of those dynasties ended at the command of God, judgment upon those houses for their continued idolatry. The final 30 years we can't really call a dynasty because only two kings came from the same family, a period of instability for sure. What can we learn from our study of the kings of Israel? Well, we can learn for sure that sin is contagious and persistent. None of these kings had the courage to stop the idol worship at Dan and Bethel, in spite of the prophets who told them to. Some got closer than others, but for whatever reason could not break with it. Each was responsible for their own sins, but when we see others sin with seemingly no consequences, it becomes easier for us to sin too. Not an excuse for sure, but a warning to us to be careful with those whom we associate ourselves with, because they could lead us off into sin. But the other lesson we can learn is that God will judge us for our sin. It will be in His time, but that judgment will come. God's patience with Israel lasted over 200 years, but it ran out, and Assyria came and took them off into captivity. The northern nation of Israel would never exist again as a kingdom. Sure, Israelites would live in that land again, but not as a nation like we read of from Joshua to 2 Kings. Following the Israelite deportation, Judah in the south would remain, with their new king Hezekiah reigning. We'll see the beginning of his reign, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 1 to 8, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.